Chapter 13. Dead in the Water. The following morning, Jack was the last one out of the room. Sprint was up and ready in less than a minute, complaining that he was hungry. Hoover, who had been dressed before Jack had even woken up, said that he could use the fresh air after being cooped up in the small quarters all night.
"It smells like a swine's sock in here," Sprint had agreed, and the two of them had left Jack to dress.
When he was finished, he put the messenger bag over his shoulder and stepped into the empty corridor. The previous night, this hallway had practically been a party, almost impassably thick with excited, mingling bodies. The three of them had found it difficult getting to their room, and it was only when Sprint had announced loudly, "Porcupine coming through," that a path had been cleared enough for them to navigate. By contrast, this morning the chamber was entirely deserted, a burgundy rug stretching endlessly in either direction. Nearing the stairs to the main deck, he heard the rhythmic crashing of ocean waves. The sound was pleasant and inviting, and he took the stairs two at a time, eager to enter the sunshine. But he slowed to a halt, perking his ears up and listening intently. He could hear the waves clearly, splashing against the hull of the ship. Shouldn't such noises be drowned out by the excited voices of the passengers? Halfway up the stairs, Jack found his way blocked by a goat in crew attire, facing away from him with a tray of drinks perched on one hoof. He stood completely still and made no acknowledgement that he recognized Jack's presence. Jack coughed. Nothing. Jack coughed again, much louder. Still no response. Finally, he ducked beneath the tray and moved around the goat, who didn't budge, nor did he blink as Jack waved a paw in front of his face. Wondering what held the goat's attention so raptly, Jack turned out toward the deck, expecting at the very least to see someone dancing around with their pants on their head. Instead, what he saw sent his eyes darting around the deck, touching on every single occupant of the open space. They were all similarly frozen, a crowded maze of wax figures wearing stupefied, blank expressions. Some were balanced mid-stride. Some held their arms up in gesture as if they'd been turned to statues mid-conversation. Jack stared wide-eyed around, trying to think of a possible explanation. This was obviously some kind of stunt, perhaps a group activity for which he'd been too late to participate. Any moment now, a whistle would blow, or a voice would call out, and the waxwork expressions on everyone's faces would melt away, turning to cheers, or perhaps even laughter at the dumbfounded look on Jack's face. Only no whistle blew. The sun bore down upon the shadeless deck, and Jack's confusion quickly turned to panic. Several minutes passed. He was forced to accept that this was not a stunt when he discovered the seasick shrew from the previous evening. The shrew had rather sparse fur on his face, and his pink skin had begun to turn tomato red under the harsh sunlight. Blisters had even begun to form on his snout. Jack placed a paw on either shoulder and gave him a heavy shake. His body was rigid, as if carved from wood, and he made no response. Heart beating heavily, Jack turned and jogged among the passengers, desperate for any sign of life. "Hello?" he yelled, hearing the fear in his own voice. "Is anyone awake?" No response. Calling again, he fell short when his eyes traveled beyond the deck and landed on something that made his legs go numb. The shore. They were nearing the city, the tallest of the buildings standing like beacons along the cliff-faced horizon. He could now see sailboats and small steamer vessels puttering around in the open harbor. He swiveled around and looked up at the flat window of the bridge, shielding his eyes against the sun, which was bouncing harshly off the glass. He could just make out the captain behind the blinding white glare, his white hat proudly perched between 5-point antlers. Jack squinted up at him and realized, to his horror, that the captain was just as incapacitated as any of the passengers. With another glance toward the shore, he bolted for the stairs leading to the captain's bridge. "I'll speed us up," he thought, taking the steps two at a time. "I can't dock this thing, but I can get us nearer, then stop and radio for help." Rounding a corner, he found the door leading to the bridge and gave it a shove. It opened only half an inch, and then halted as if striking a wall. He pushed again. There was definitely something, or someone, pressed up against the opposite side of the door. He put his full body into a third push, but he knew immediately that it was no use. Whoever was blocking the door seemed to weigh as much as a rhinoceros, and with all of his strength, Jack couldn't move it an inch further. Kicking it in frustration, he ran back down to the deck. In the seemingly short span of time, the harbor had drawn much closer, a sheer cliff face against which he could now see a white line of breaking water. Above the cliff, the details of the cityscape were becoming distinguishable. No longer a jagged mass, but individual high-rises and steeples, water towers, and one buttressed cathedral, atop which Jack could even make out the silhouettes of 5 gargoyles looming down upon the sea. The call of a harbor gull reached the ship. Having seen this behavior as they had disembarked, he understood that the gull was calling to acknowledge their approach, and that someone on board was meant to reciprocate, but the gull on board would be unable to respond. "Help!" he bellowed, flailing his arms. "Help!" But he was no gull. His calls were soft, lost on the wind, and he knew they wouldn't reach the gull on shore. The harbor was getting dangerously close. That cliff face was only minutes off. He could now properly count the gargoyles along the rim of the cathedral, 4, not 5. Row upon row of piers stretched out over the water like banded wooden fingers, nearly all teeming with crowds of seals basking in the sunshine. They were so close Jack could hear their barked conversations. "Help!" he called, throwing his upper body over the railing as if hurling the words at them. A few lifted their lazy heads. The shoreline gull was joined by several others, the calls becoming much more frequent and shrill. The nearest of the piers was so close now, he could make out the individual barnacles creeping up from the water.
"Whoa, whoa, whoa, whoa!"
the group of seals cried as they scrambled over one another and into the water. The boards snapped loudly as the ship's hull wedged into the pier, sending splinters to the air and seals cursing into the waves. The vessel rattled at each beam, but made no sign of slowing. Having struck the pier at an angle, the ship shook free and trundled on in the direction of the rock face, the vulgar swears of the seals still audible from below. The cliff drew nearer and nearer. By this point a crowd was gathering at its edge 100 feet up, pointing toward the ship. "Help!" Jack called to them, but he knew it was no use. What could anyone do? Even if the captain were to wake up and put the ship into full reverse, at this speed they were going to hit the wall. But as he braced himself and let out a frightened hiss of air, his breath formed a swirling cloud that rose before his eyes. The exposed skin of his inner ears and nose became chill, and he felt his body tremble with the sudden cold. A musical crunching sound, like the slow cracking of glass, rose from over the deck's edge. The ship's hull rattled and whined loudly, fighting against some obstacle. Jack ran to the railing and looked over. A field of enormous icy shards coated the surface of the water, an alien terrain of 10-foot-tall crystal barbs that started at the ship's hull and stretched out over the water. And it was working. The shadow of the cliff began to creep over the deck, but had only reached the bridge before the ship came to a halt, the engines roaring in vain. Beneath the shade, a change came over the passengers. All at once, they seemed to break from their trance. Some looked confused, disoriented. Others looked horrified. The shrew let out a bellowing shriek and dunked his head into the punch bowl. As the passengers rubbed their heads and looked around in confusion, that same musical crunching sound could be heard overhead, like the tinkling of a crystal chandelier. Looking up, Jack was astonished to see what could only be described as a bridge being formed from the same splinter-like shards of ice. It stretched from the top of the cliff high above, materializing from thin air, sloping until it touched down on the deck of the ship. And stepping coolly across its surface, passing impressively over their heads, an emperor penguin glowered down upon the crowd. Jack recognized him from the countless times he had appeared in newspapers and on television. He wore a silver vest and pants, with a blue tie that bulged beneath his chin. He stopped 10 feet above the deck, his gaze sweeping across the now silent crowd. "Who did this?" President Alexander Brisk demanded. A moment of silence passed as the passengers looked amongst themselves. Then, raising a quivering hoof, the unfriendly doe, who had been so irritated by Sprint bumping her seat, stepped forward.